Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 10 video. Today's video will be a countdown of the top champions for rank play in patch 11.6. These champions are essential to the current meta, whether as a carry, support, or frontliner. Overall, the meta definitely favors 4 and 5 cost champions the most, so expect to see quite a few in our top 10. One last thing to note is that there was a hotfix B patch that recently came out. The effects of this hot patch remain to be seen, but we have taken them into consideration for the units affected. With all that said, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off our top 10, we have Tristana coming in at number 10. Despite Tristana getting hit by the nerf bat a few times, including most recently in the hotfix B patch for 11.6, she's still by far the best performing one-cost champion. Few other early game units compare to the consistency she brings, as even a 1-star Tristana can win rounds if you have Dragon Soul or Sharpshooter. They even buffed her 1-star damage, so she's even better after the B patch. Prior to 11.6, Tristana was a powerhouse champion all game and was a common part of the meta with Spirit Sharpshooters. Some players still tried to make her work as a 3-star post-nerfs, but have had mixed success, and now with the nerf to her damage at tier 3, she's even less likely to do well past the early game. All in all, she's definitely the best one-cost unit you can grab early game if your goal is to try to win streak. Let's move on to the number 9 champion on the list, Kennen. With the meta heavily influenced by 4 and 5 cost champions, it's important to know which low-cost champions are worth playing. There are several 3-cost champions in the game to choose from, such as Kindred, Katarina, or Kayle, but Kennen stands above them all. Kennen brings stability to early and mid-game compositions thanks to his high damage output and AoE crowd control. In addition to that, he's a keeper, which boosts up the defense of your board and allows him to comfortably be played on the front line. Keeper and Kennen go hand in hand, as the trait relies heavily on him to do well, and Kennen relies on the trait to survive in the front line. Considering how popular late-game Keeper is, it's not a surprise we see Kennen played frequently. The main downside to Kennen is due to his popularity throughout the game. He can be somewhat difficult to 2-star with multiple players contesting him. One of the best variations of Keeper is having a chosen Kennen, which isn't a super consistent option every game. Still, those minor issues aside, Kennen is certainly the most consistent and well-rounded 3-cost champion in the meta. Next up, we have the cornerstone of our top 10, Ornn, who comes in as the number 8 champion. Good old reliable Ornn slides himself back into our top 10 once again because artifacts are still so useful. Putting aside his artifacts for a second, Ornn as a champion isn't doing all that well. Sure, he has a place in certain late game compositions as a frontliner, but the reality is, Vanguard is weaker in the meta and Ornn rarely ever hits with his ability. Those two factors combined make Ornn as a baseline champion not all that great, especially as a 5-cost champ. Of course, we're not here to judge Ornn on those factors alone. Ornn is all about his artifacts, and those artifacts are still a key part to the mid to late game meta. There's often a stark contrast to players' boards with artifacts and those without, which makes a lot of sense as TFT places a lot of emphasis on the value of items. So Ornn keeps his spot in the top 10 and is unlikely to lose it until the end of the set. Our first 4-cost carry comes in at number 7, Kayle. Look, this list is stacked with 4 and 5-cost carries. This means we have to rate some lower than others, and with the hotfix B patch, we've decided to bump Kayle a bit lower than we otherwise would have. Of course, the patch was only 10 damage nerf to her ability at level 2, as it went from 150 bonus damage to 140, but that's still enough to lower her value in the meta. One of the major flaws of Kayle is the lack of flexibility when using her. Unlike Slayers, which have multiple carries that don't have specific item requirements, or Aurelion Sol that can do well as even a 1-star champion, Kayle needs to be 2 stars, and with the right items to carry. That lack of flexibility and reliance on specific items makes her overall value slightly less than other 4-cost carries in the meta. That said, Kayle with Executioner is still a top-tier comp. It's capable of finishing in the top 4 consistently and can win games, so even though we've ranked Kayle somewhat low on the list, she's still one of the best champions in the meta. Moving along, we have Tryndamere coming in at number 6. This meta is still all about Slayers, and more Slayers. The fact is that the trait and champions have so much flexibility that you can pivot into any flavor of that composition that suits your current needs. Tryndamere doesn't quite hit the same highs as Olaf or Samira, but he does bring a lot of consistency, whether as a main carry or a secondary. If there was a negative to Tryndamere, it's mostly that his damage isn't AoE. Sure, he does spin, but when it comes down to it, he's only killing one target at a time, whereas Olaf can cleave and Samira does way more damage when she spins. Another slight issue is that there's some counterplay against Tryndamere, so good players can manipulate how effective he ends up being in fights. This is done by clumping up unimportant and frontline units as Tryndamere spins towards the largest grouping. It's not the most reliable counterplay, but enough to slow down Tryndamere in fights. Overall, Tryndamere is a solid 4-cost champion that can be both a carry as well as a secondary carry, which is great in a meta that favors flexibility. We have mentioned him a few times now, so the next champion is Olaf, who comes in at number 5. Olaf, only 5th on the list, may seem somewhat surprising considering that he's the best auto-attacking 4-cost carry. But that's just how stacked the top 10 is, as we have to weigh his value against the other champions on the list. He comes out ahead of both Tryndamere and Kayle, but doesn't quite make the cut against other champions we have lower on the list. The reason for that is the lack of consistency. Olaf too can devastate enemy boards, but sometimes he can fall flat and not get a lot done. This is mainly due to his damage output being tied to his life. The lower it is, the more damage he'll do, which leaves him in a vulnerable position. And to maximize that damage, he does want Dragon Soul, which may not always go to him early on in a fight. All in all, Olaf may have his downsides, but the fact remains he's one of the best carries in the current meta. Up next, we have Lee Sin coming in as the number 4 champion. Of all the champions on today's list, and really in general for set 4.5, Lee Sin is the most frustrating to play against. The chance to completely eliminate an enemy unit by kicking them off the board is ridiculously strong, and therefore ridiculously obnoxious. Sure, it won't always happen right away. Lee Sin generally has to kick the unit twice, and there's issues with pathing and all that, but the fact remains that he can completely swing a fight by kicking off an important unit. On top of having a powerful ability, Lee Sin also dips his toe into several late game comps. Since he's divine, he fits well with Kayle, and being a duelist, he can be played alongside Tryndamere. Outside of that, you may not find too many useful combinations with his traits, but honestly, he does plenty well as a standalone champ. There are few champions in the game that you can just toss in and get great value, and Lee Sin is the best of them. Our last 4-cost carry on today's list is Aurelion Sol coming in at number 3. Aurelion and mages are doing quite well in the meta. Slayers may be all around more dominant, but mages have a lot of flexibility due to the number of variations that you can play them in. And of course, the success of mage is all tied to Aurelion Sol, since he needs the trait to do well. But as long as he has at least 3 mage, he will be able to carry, which is why mage is so flexible, since you can play any 3, 5, or 7 of the trait. It does need to be noted that the 7 mage trait was nerfed in the hotfix patch. The nerf was only by 5%, as the bonus ability power went from 135% to 130%. While this is a nerf, it ultimately won't make too much of a difference, especially since Aurelion Sol can do fine without the 7 mage buff. But a nerf is a nerf, so keep that in mind moving forward. Aurelion Sol is also one of the few 4-cost carries that does really well as a 1-star unit. Since his damage is tied mostly to items and the mage trait, as long as you have those, you can skate by with just a 1-star Aurelion for most of the mid-game. It's not only until you begin hitting the later stages of the game that you will need to 2-star him, meaning that you can generally get to level 8 comfortably. Aurelion isn't the best carry in the meta, but he's likely the best 4-cost carry. Up next, we have Swain coming in as the number 2 champion. Swain. Swain is a powerhouse late-game champion with a lot of flexibility thanks to Siphoner. Siphoner, being a splashable 2-piece trait, fits in with practically every late-game comp. What this means is that there's always a clear way to upgrade your board in the late game by trying to hit a 2-star Swain. Not only does he bring Siphoner, but he's also a solid frontliner that's very hard to kill. Swain is also highly valued because of Dragon Soul. This makes him a key unit in strengthening a Slayer board, as he helps get 3 Dragon Soul for Olaf and can be used for Siphoner. The last aspect about Swain is that he's one of the best, if not the best, users of the Mage Spatula. Turning Swain into a mage not only increases his damage output, it also makes him far harder to kill, as the health he gains for transforming is also increased. Not only is Swain valuable for most compositions thanks to Siphoner, and is great for Slayers because of Dragon Soul, he's also amazing with mages. And now for the number 1 champion on our list, Samira. This shouldn't come as a surprise that Samira is the top champion of the current meta. She's easily the best carry for Slayers, which is currently the best synergy in the game. Her damage output is crazy even as a 1-star champion, but even more so if you can 2-star her with good items. Samira by herself can basically wipe out an entire enemy board. There's really not much else that needs to be said about Samira, as everyone should know just how good she is at this point. That's going to be it for our top 10 champions for patch 11.6. But before we go, we of course have a few honorable mentions to talk about. Our first honorable mention is Sejuani. Sejuani often has a place in our top 10 because of how solid she is as a frontline champion. And don't let being an honorable mention fool you, Sejuani is still an essential component to the meta thanks to her crowd control. Unfortunately, Vanguard has lost some value in the meta, which opened the door to other frontline champions, so the priority of running units like Sejuani and Aatrox has gone down. Still, she's one of the best frontliners you can have in your composition, so don't pass her by if you can fit her onto your board. Up next is Neeko. We're mainly highlighting Neeko because she received a decent buff in the hotfix patch. Her ability's damage went from 200, 300, 400 to 250, 350, 450. It's a decent buff considering she gained 50 damage at each tier. The main issue with Neeko is that she really only matters in one composition, that being Vanguard Mystic Fabled. This buff just makes the composition slightly better, and that's about it. And our last honorable mention is for both Yone and Shen. These two have gained a lot of value in the meta as late game frontline units now that Vanguard isn't as strong. Adept is a useful trait, especially towards the late game. We'll be keeping an eye on these two as they continue to rise in the meta, especially Yone, who's been buffed practically every patch. Alright, that's all we have for you for today's video, folks. We're still in a Slayer-focused meta, but at least there's plenty of viable champions to choose from. There's plenty of carries with a lot of late game options. Let us know in the comments section below if there's any champions that you think deserve to be on the list. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.